Well, Hugh, as we stay with this wonderful book that is indeed capturing the mood of the country at the moment, it would seem. A great many people are taking an interest in it, and the very title is obviously addressing something very important in the nation's psyche. Can I ask there, to begin with, just to open our conversation, having written the book on the good life, why, in fact, is a good life important at all? And can I extend that perhaps even by asking, why be good? Because we live, obviously, in a very competitive environment, and indeed, it's an environment in which almost on a daily basis we encounter a good deal of self-interest. And yet you're suggesting through this book that, that there's another way of living other than self-interest. So why should we be good? And why is a good life an important consideration and reflection for us?
Yes. Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody. A wonderful question, of course, to begin the conversation. And everyone has their own answer to a question like that. Some people want to draw on motivations arising from their religious faith or their philosophical orientation. My answer is actually much more primitive than that. As you say, we're very easily driven by self-interest, and I think personally, and I think I speak for other people as well, I'm tired of hearing what a self-interested species humans are, how we're just out for number one, it's all about me, we're competitive, we're potentially even violent in our determination to get our own way. Now, there are plenty of bits of evidence in human history and in the contemporary world to support that view, but I think that's a tiny part of the story of the human nature, the human condition, the human species. I think the deeper truth about us is that, like many other species on Earth, we are social creatures. That is our nature. We are by nature people who do this. We congregate. Now, when I'm turning away from the microphone, am I still audible? Yes, good. I was going to suggest we should change places so we're both facing our microphones. We are by nature congregators. Look how we live in cities, suburbs, towns, villages. There are hermits, there are isolates, there are people who are reclusive. They are very, very unusual. The vast majority of us depend on communities to sustain us. That is our nature. We're herd animals, we're tribal creatures, whatever term you prefer. And because we rely on communities to sustain us, it dawns on us eventually. Some of us learn it at a very early age, in the family or in the school playground or in the parish or wherever. It dawns on us that communities don't just happen. We need them. It's the human nature to be part of a community, but communities can easily fragment, and there are plenty of pressures. I've spent much of my professional life documenting the factors that have caused communities and neighbourhoods around Australia to disintegrate. They don't necessarily cohere. They only cohere if we nurture them. And I think that's the deepest truth about humans. There's a beautiful symmetry in this. We need communities, but communities need us. And if we're going to let what is in all of us, namely our selfish, self-absorbed, self-interested selves dominate, the community will suffer, will damage the fabric of communities. If we're going to allow our more altruistic, our more cooperative natures to prevail, the community will thrive and prosper, and let's be fair, we're the beneficiaries of that as well. So it's a circular argument. But I think when we don't act well, to come back to the proposition of being good, I mean, being good is about being morally good, and being morally good is about how we attend to other people, how we respond to the needs of other people. What else could it be about? So to the extent we ignore that as our nature, we damage communities, and we in turn suffer.
I remember some time ago, Michael Looney himself actually changed the title "Crimes Against Humanity" to "Crimes Against Community."
Yes.
Because he himself would recognise what you were saying, the dissolution of community life, and that there are certain policies and certain actions that in fact are detrimental to our experience of community. Yep. But the crime against community is just as significant as the crime against humanity. Because
yes.
we only find our humanity precisely through community.
Yes.
But it's fascinating, isn't it, too, Hugh? I remember you saying years ago that in the face of the statistics that demonstrate that more and more Australians are living alone, one of the great indicators, in fact, of redemption almost, is the growth of restaurants, the growth
yes.
of cafes, the growth
yes.
of coffee shops. Because I remember you saying that these actually demonstrate our need to come together, even if it's only for a cup of coffee. Why do people, in fact, bring even their laptop into a coffee shop instead of staying at home in their apartment when they might live alone and do their work?
Yes.
Because there is this instinctive need in us to be around, as you said.
Yes.
At that stage, if I recall, we are herd animals.
Yes.
We need one another. And that need begins to show itself in a whole variety of ways. It shows itself in our need to graze with one another.
Yes, yes.
It also reminds me that a comment of George Miller, the film producer,
yes.
he once said, why do we still gather in cinemas to watch a film when we have all the capacity to watch a film in the isolation of our own home?
Yes.
And he said, because we have forgotten the need of people to gather together to listen to a story. And so he had said, if I recall correctly, he said, the cinema today is the covert cathedral
yes.
of today, and
yes.
the filmmakers are the high priests of our society, because we have forgotten the need of people to gather together to listen to a story. And filmmakers actually today are those who bring people together to listen to a story, and we need to be with others as we hear a story.
Yes.
So these are fascinating intimations of this basic human need for community, aren't they?
They are, David. In fact, I'd just add one other thought to that. One of our characteristics recently, it's all, I mean, the ancient Greeks started all this, but it's become a bit of a somewhat out of hand, I think, recently. And this is the idea that I must find the answer to the question, who am I? Now, I think if we spend too much of our lives searching for the answer to the question, who am I, two things will happen. One is we'll be disappointed because we'll find the answer isn't terribly interesting. I'm just like everyone else. There's a unique Hugh, but the most important things to be said about Hugh or David are that we are like everyone else. So it's not a terrifically interesting quest. But the more important problem with it is that it denies what I think is the far more significant question, which is, who are we? One of my professional heroes, the American psychotherapist Carl Rogers, now deceased, reflecting on his work with the troubled, wounded people who came into his clinical practice, his conclusion was that when people come to a realization of who they are, it is always to acknowledge that they are not alone, that they are inextricably part of a circle, that they belong to a family or a neighbourhood or an organisation, a community of some kind, that the real insight in the quest for self-knowledge is that it's actually not about me. It's about us and where I fit, where I belong.
And I think this is actually one of the great benefits of post-modernity. We often think of post-modernity in negative terms. I think that post-modernism is somehow antithetical to holding religious values in particular, because it celebrates diversity and relativity, I suppose, of different positions. But in fact, postmodernity in its essence, I think, has further illustrated to us, or at least it highlights to us, that we can only find ourselves in relation to the other. That the quest for the self as something entire in itself or self-sufficient unto itself is illusory.
Yes.
That it's only in an openness to that which is other than ourself that we will actually ever find who we are.
Yes.
So we can never find the I without the we.
Yes. Yes, I think that's true. The South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu had a wonderful remark that we exist in a bundle of belonging. And that's, I think, the absolute truth about us.
Yes, and he uses that wonderful African notion, in fact, called Ubuntu. Have you heard of it?
Yes, indeed, yes.
It's a beautiful African notion that I exist only in relation to the others in the tribe.
That's right.
But it speaks also of a beautiful, when I have that profound sense that I can only discover who I am in relation to the community in which I live. That is, the community in which I live is actually gives me my identity. Then it actually creates a certain graciousness in heart.
Yes.
And so the one who is profoundly conscious of their interdependency rather than of their independence is the one then who reflects a graciousness of life. And so Ubuntu speaks not only of that interdependence of identity, but also of this fundamental hospitality of spirit and this graciousness of life. It's, but I think if we stay with that issue for a moment, in a certain sense, would you say then that the gracious life is another way of expressing the good life, or is the gracious life in fact then an outcome of the good life?
Yes, I think I'd say it that way around, David. I mean, the essence of the good life, to me, because of our social nature, the essence of the good life is that it is, as every religious and philosophical tradition on earth tells us, it is a life lived for others. It's a life lived in response to the needs of other people, not a life lived as a doormat. There has to be time for us, there has to be time of refreshment and replenishment and all of those things. But our mission, our goal, our purpose is to serve one another. So if we capture that as the way of investing our lives with meaning, that I think the outcome of that is that we'll be more gracious as individuals. There's no real place for rudeness, discourtesy, impatience, social exclusion, any of these appalling phenomena of contemporary society, if we're committed to goodness. Goodness, I mean, if goodness is a moral concept, how can we make any sense of a moral concept without talking about engagement, without talking about community? You can't be good in isolation.
No, and I think the conscience, conscience is the fruit of a community, of being aware of how embedded I am in community. Where there is no sense of community, you cannot expect a conscience to grow.
Yes.
So conscience, the sense of conscience, is in direct proportion to my experience of being connected.
Yes, I think that's very true. And we see it even today. We see it in a city like Sydney in vandalism and other antisocial acts committed by people who don't feel engaged, who don't feel connected, through no fault of their own, but whose formative experiences have led them to think they're outside this, or they're not going to be full participants in the wealth, in the broadest sense, of this society, they will behave in a completely different way from people who feel connected.
In Malta a couple of years ago, there's no graffiti in Malta, which really was quite a striking feature of Malta. But it struck me that was because there's such a strong sense of being part of a community in Malta.
Yes.
And you get the same stories in the great slums of Kolkata, where crime is, in fact, not to say it's not without crime, but crime is not as one would expect, simply because people all know one another.
Yes.
People all have a sense of who each other is.
Yes.
And therefore, that community awareness is, in fact, one of the great contributors to maintaining the level of crime.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So once we go beneath this idea that we are individuals, independent, with a strong sense of personal identity, to the richer truth that we are actually members of something larger, and that it's our social identity that really defines us, that we belong to each other, it changes everything. It would be very hard to offend against someone else if you had the sense that we are all one.
And so there in your book, Hugh, you then, as part of that, identify, as it were, the three primary, you call them the three therapies of the good life, but they're almost, as it were, the three strategies, aren't they? I mean, these are the three elements then that actually prove whether we do believe in the good life or otherwise.
Yes.
And that is the capacity to listen, and you've done a lot of work previously on that, but then also the capacity to apologise sincerely and to forgive generously. Because each of those three exercises demonstrate whether we do believe we are connected or not.
Yes, absolutely. That's the point. So I'd see them as the key symptoms of someone who's leading the good life, someone who's understood our interconnectedness, our interdependence. In a way, well, I think all three of them are crucial, and I also in the book describe them, as you say, as the three great therapies of everyday life. They're the way in which each of us can act as each other's therapist. Nothing is more therapeutic than those three. Nothing is more therapeutic than to be listened to, because when I'm listened to, the message I'm being sent, unspoken, is that I'm taken seriously, that I'm valued, that I am part of this relationship, I'm part of this group. These people are actually listening to me, or this person is listening to me. Now, we can all nod and say, yeah, that's terrific. What we often overlook is that when, because of distraction or impatience or a lack of charity, we don't listen to someone who needs to be listened to, the message we're sending that person is a message we would never send them explicitly, but we send it implicitly when we fail to listen, and the message is, sorry, I don't take you seriously enough to bother listening. You're not important enough to me to attend to. Now, who'd want to say that to a spouse, or to a child, or to a neighbour, or to an employee, or a colleague, or a friend? But whenever we shortchange people in this business of listening, that is actually the message we send.
And that was the key feature of Rogers, wasn't it? Rogers' therapeutic method.
Yes.
The capacity of the therapist to listen.
Yes.
And to create a space in which the other experience themselves as being truly listened to.
That's right.
And I remember Simone Weil, the great feminist writer in the 1920s and 30s. She too put listening as absolutely critical.
Yes.
So that it is the most important thing that we can ever give another. And she said, in fact, it's the miracle of life, in so many words. Precisely because if someone does feel listened to, then they are indeed deeply connected to another.
That's right.
And that in itself then releases a capacity beyond their imagination.
Yes. I think I absolutely agree with Vale about that. I think we perhaps don't fully appreciate the sense in which listening is a gift and not listening is the withholding of a gift. But it is a gift because it's the most humble thing or humbling thing we ever do. I don't just mean hearing someone, I mean actually actively engaged in the task of listening to them. Because when I do that, I'm saying, just for the moment, doesn't matter what I think, just for the moment, all the focus is on what you think, and I'm going to try to understand what you think. I'm going to enter into what you're telling me. I'm going to entertain these ideas. That is a spectacular gift. It's the gift of me sacrificing myself for the moment to your concerns. It may end up that I say to you, actually, David, that came across to me as something I couldn't buy. I totally, profoundly disagree with you, but I'm only in a position to disagree if I have first engaged and given you that gift.
Yes. Simone Weil, from memory, she says, the soul empties itself of all of its own contents in order to be present before the one.
Yes.
Before, and in order to receive the other in all their truth and all their beauty.
Yes.
But she said this is the most difficult thing.
Yes.
The most difficult thing for us to
And Rogers says the same thing. Rogers also says, do we understand how hard this is? We perhaps don't understand how hard it is because we don't do it very often. We go through the motions. We nod and smile and appear to be listening, but we're actually composing our reply or thinking, goodness, I'd better pick up the meat before the butcher closes while this person is talking. Now that, of course, is not listening. Rogers says it's one of the hardest things we ever do because it's risky. When we listen, we run the risk of having to change in response to what we hear. And he goes further. I think this is, in a way, one of his most powerful propositions, that if we're not running the risk of being changed in response to what we hear, then we're not actually listening. That's a huge challenge, isn't it? If you think you know what you believe, for example, and someone wants to present an alternative view of the mysteries, am I actually going to be able to listen? Am I going to run the risk of modifying my own view?
And it strikes me there, Hugh, that listening then is the absolute foundation for conversation, in the sense that because conversation takes us to that place of change, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
And it's always struck me that there's such an extraordinary link between the two words of conversation and conversion. But we shouldn't be surprised by the similarity of the two words, because if we are truly listening and in our listening being prepared to enter into a conversation,
yes,
and allow a conversation to take place,
yes,
then we are risking all of our present self-understanding.
Yes.
We are opening ourselves to seeing things in an entirely different way than we'd started with. And as a result, something changes deep within us.
Yes.
We're never the same at the end of a good conversation than we were at the beginning of the conversation. So the conversation, it would seem to me, is one of the primary pathways to conversion.
Yes.
Understanding conversion.
Yes, in the broader sense, yes. Yes. And one of the essential features of the good life, because conversation says, I want to engage with you, I want to be connected, I want us to belong to each other in the sharing of what's on your mind or what's on my mind.
It would strike me, Hugh, that conversation is in something of a crisis today, because and I wonder in some ways whether we're losing the art of conversation, because conversation takes time and it takes presence.
Yes.
And presence is more than the exchange of data.
Yes, absolutely.
And
yes.
I wonder whether we've, in fact, and I know you've written about this in a number of places, but we've often confused communication with well, put it this way, we've confused the exchange of data with communication.
Yes, yes.
And so because this seems to be a real liability of the communication revolution in which we find ourselves, it's also the great paradox that never before have we had so much access to one another, but never before have we felt, in fact, so isolated from one another. And so this sense of extraordinary access on the one hand and yet isolation on the other hand would seem to me to indicate that genuine communication is not taking place because the elements of time and presence aren't there to, in fact, truly listen and allow the conversation to begin.
Yes, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's not happening, but I would certainly say it's in decline in the face of the latest wave of the information technology revolution. It's, of course, a very, very long revolution. I mean, the invention of the printing press started all this by taking away the message from the author, so that we began over the space of 500 years to the point where we finally became a literate society, a print-based society in terms of mass communication. We learned to try and deal with the message without the author being present. The words were taken out of the author's mouth and put on the page. That was a huge cultural revolution, and all the other things that have happened right up to Facebook and Twitter are extensions of that same cultural revolution. It's just that they're proliferating, they're becoming ubiquitous, and they're in a way exaggerating what that original mass media revolution was about in the way that you've described. I think we're in the grip now of an information technology revolution happening so quickly that I wouldn't be prepared to say where it's going to lead us. There are hints. There are a couple of general things, I think. One thing we can say is the good thing about it, particularly for younger people, is that it fuels their tribalism. It fuels their sense of belonging to each other. They're a bit like an ancient primitive tribe where there's a sort of web of connectedness that vibrates continuously. They have the phone on under their pillow in case it vibrates, you know. FOMO, fear of missing out, you know. I have to know every minute what someone is thinking or saying, even if it's only in 140.
A certain desperation.
Well, it becomes desperate because it's overstimulation. And because it's overstimulation, that cranks the whole thing up to the point where I need the overstimulation. I mean, we now have a generation of young people more inclined than any previous generation to say, I'm bored. And they're bored because they're overstimulated. So you withdraw the stimulation and expect conversation, for example, and they say, this is a bit boring. We have to compete with all of that. But that sense of being connected is probably a good thing to some extent. The downside is the one you've identified, David. It's that you tend to confuse the sending of a text or the posting of a message on Facebook or on Twitter with communication. I've sent the message. Well, as we know, what we're doing now requires a lot more than the words. It's about facial expression, tone of voice, posture, gesture, ambience, all of these things which you captured in the word presence. We are present to each other. Now, if we're linked via Facebook or any other manifestation of the new communication technology, we are linked, but we're not present. And that's the dilemma about the new technology and the old technology, that it seems to bring us together, but makes it easier than ever to stay apart.
Yes, there's a great paradox, isn't it? Somebody was telling me just the other day, actually, about two cousins, one living in Sydney, one living in Perth. They were texted furiously for years, or for months at least, and this was going on all day, every day kind of thing. And then they actually had a holiday together, and they couldn't. It just didn't work because
yes.
They were having to be present to one another,
yes.
And they couldn't cope.
Yes. Well, this often happens.
Kind of a classic example.
Yes.
Of this, the very thing that you're
yes.
talking about. So, Hugh, in terms of that paradox, I mean, this is in fact an extraordinary social paradox which we face. It would seem to me that somehow the good life has to address this paradox. So how do we, as it were, find the stepping stones in the midst of this particular paradox?
I'm optimistic about this, David, in the same way as our shrinking households have led to food courts, the public trough, where we feel as if we're together because we're eating together. I'm optimistic that because and that's an expression of a deep social need. In the same way, I think our deep social need to connect will finally lead to some reappraisal of the place of all this technology in our lives. Another example of the phenomenon of those two cousins you referred to is the number of people who fall in love on the internet and get themselves whipped up into a frenzy and then meet, and they'd rather be texting. No chemistry. So it finally does dawn on us that this is not the same thing at all. And I think, well, I was speaking to the girls, senior girls at Abbottsley this morning, just down the road, and a number of them were saying how appalled they are when they see girls around the school texting when there are all these other girls to talk to. Now that was 16, 17-year-olds being appalled. In Europe, some recent research has pointed to a mass exodus by older adolescents from Facebook. Facebook is dead to them. Now that doesn't mean they've abandoned information technology, and the reason they've abandoned Facebook is quite amusing. It's because their parents are there. Their parents used to say, "Why are you doing this? Get off Facebook." Now their parents are saying, "Stay on Facebook," because that's the only way they can find out what they're up to. So the kids are deserting Facebook. But I'm confident. We go through these wild pendulum swings, and I'm confident that the pendulum on this point has swung too far. It's challenged our sense of privacy. It's challenged our sense of identity. Some of that is good because it's in the pool. Some recent Australian research showed that young Australians are very disturbed by the idea that information they put on various social media sites is not secure. They don't like that, but they keep doing it. So they actually don't care about security and privacy the way we might. But I do think they are still social creatures. Their social needs are not diminished, and I think as parents and grandparents and pastors and teachers and others, it's important for us to say to our young people, take a look at the amount of time you're spending with a screen. In a way it's connecting you to other people, but your relationship is actually with the screen. Take a look at the proportion of your day you spend with the screen and weigh that up against the proportion of your day you're spending with other people, face to face. And if you've got to the stage where you're spending more time with one kind of screen or another than you are with your fellow humans, you have a problem.
Yes, it's interesting to note on that. I don't know if this anecdotally, but the number of young people getting their driver's license has dramatically decreased today. And it would seem because in the past, young people would be very eager to get their driver's license, because that would mean that they would have wheels to go and visit, to go out and visit their friends. But they don't need to go out and visit their friends today. They can just stay at home and Skype them and so forth.
Yes.
But I would sense a real, I hear those kinds of stories with a certain angst, I must admit.
Oh yes, I think the angst is well placed. I think there's something to be deeply concerned about here. And quite apart from all of these social anxieties, or anxieties about the quality of their social life and their social identity, there are other factors which we don't have to explore now. But Susan Greenfield, the British neuroscientist, is concerned about the actual brain effects as a result of so much time spent with digital media.
There's the principle of King's has also written a fair bit on that.
Yes.
What this is doing neurologically.
Yes.
Hugh, just moving along a little bit from that, when we talk about presence and when we talk about listening, when we talk about presence, when we talk about the capacity for conversation, we really, in many ways, we're also talking a great deal about the need of humility, aren't we? And humility is not a word that we use a great deal today. In fact, it would hardly be a word considered to be in vogue at all.
Yes.
And yet it's absolutely critical for the kind of communication that we're really talking about, isn't it?
It is.
I'm thinking of here humility, not in terms of being passive or being a doormat, as you mentioned, but it's really the capacity for self-sacrifice. That is the capacity to let go of my own thinking and to be open to another's thinking. But in some ways, what we, as you've identified in the book, we live at a time where the self has extraordinary primacy. And it would seem to me that part of that, and as you intimate in the book, that where we place so much emphasis on how we feel, then it's inevitable that the self has such primacy.
Yes.
But the primacy of the self is in fact one of the greatest obstacles to recovering this new sense of communalism.
Yes.
But it also seems to me that we live at a time that feelings have achieved an extraordinary dominance in the way that people evaluate life and what they consider to be good.
Yes.
So now we live in a time where unless something feels good, it is not good. Unless it feels right, it's not right.
Yes.
And so, and this is something in fact quite new for Western consciousness, because in the past, when we think of classical times, it was feelings didn't count for very much. We forget, in fact, how recent the autobiography is.
Yes.
And not so much the autobiography, but how recent the novel is, because the novel, in fact, is tracing the subjectivity of characters.
Yes.
But in the past, in terms of the great ballads and whatnot, it's not what people felt that mattered, it was what people did, and how they acted that mattered.
Yes.
Now we have an extraordinary concern for how we feel. But the more concerned about how we feel, then in fact there's a privatisation of the self actually taking place, isn't there?
Yes, that's true. I think the idea of goodness in our lives and the idea of moral purpose as central to our lives has been hijacked by two contemporary industries in a way. One is the marketing industry, which has sold us on the idea that the good life is a life of material comfort and prosperity and financial security and so on. The other is the happiness industry, which has fueled this idea that if you're leading the good life, you would feel good. And feeling good equals being happy, as though happiness is the default position. Now, it's very interesting what you said a moment ago, David, about the ancient view of all this didn't take emotions into account. I mean, Aristotle, who wrote so extensively about this Greek concept of eudaimonia, which is popularly translated today as happiness, if you look at what Aristotle, when he was talking about the good life, the life of eudaimonia, he was talking about living in accordance with our sense of virtue, being fully engaged with society, performing our civic duty. He was talking about living in accordance with a sense of purpose. He was also talking about entering into, the phrase is something like entering into the full richness of human love and friendship, which comes closer to an emotional idea. But of course, if you do enter into the full richness of human love and friendship, one thing you discover pretty quickly is that's not all sweetness and light. That's not all bright, shiny stuff. The full richness of human love and friendship entails pain, disappointment, frustration. We let each other down. All of these things happen in even the most loving relationships. So I think we've lost a lot of that complexity, necessary complexity, and just come down to this mad idea that if you're doing well, if you're living well, you'll feel good. That happiness is your birthright, and that if you're not happy, well, get happy. So we say, and there's a child crying, and the parent, I suppose naturally, instinctively says, come on, give us a smile. Would be far more help to the development of that child's emotional development, but moral development as well, if we said, okay, well, we all feel like this sometimes. Where did this come from? You know, I wonder what we can learn from this. The idea that feeling good is a symptom of the good life is crazy I think at two levels. One is, if we settle for emotions as an important indicator of whether we're doing the right thing or not, well, emotions are incredibly easy to manipulate. Listen to a particular piece of music, watch a particular movie, eat a particular substance. I mean, we all feel happier after lunch than before lunch. So just eat more. You'll feel better more often. Drink more. There is a whole pharmacological industry available to offer substances, licit and illicit, designed to manipulate your emotions. Preachers do it, poets do it, politicians do it, parents do it. We're all at it, and it's not all that hard to do. So if you just wanted to be happy, you could do it. But
in fact, life becomes more and more brittle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it becomes...
and unidimensional.
One of the most frustrating questions that I'm ever asked is, are you happy?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Well, it's the wrong question.
That's right, and I think we have to say that. We have to say, wrong question, ask me if I'm whole.
Right.
You know, ask me if I'm suffering.
Do I live with a sense of purpose?
Yeah.
A sense of,
yeah.
But I think if we live with a sense of purpose, then we have to be prepared, don't we, to often live with uncomfortable feelings.
Yes.
And feelings of unease and dislocation.
Yes. Yes, the full spectrum.
The full spectrum.
And in fact, some recent, some of the positive psychologists in the American School of Positive Psychology have been having a bit of a rethink about all this emphasis on happiness and self-esteem and so on. Coming now to the conclusion, which I suppose, you know, has been with us forever, but we're just reconsidering it, that it's not about the happiness in your life. It's about the sense of meaningfulness in your life. A Harvard psychologist, one of the people currently rethinking all this, wrote very amusingly about a study that he had done in which he learned that parents report that they are typically at their happiest when they are not with their children, when they've gone out for a night off, you know, out for dinner or playing golf or something. But that their deepest sense of meaningfulness is, of course, when they are with their children. If you don't have children, you can see the same thing in work. Very few people on Monday morning skip to work singing merry songs about the joys of the workplace. But almost everyone who works, paid or unpaid, almost everyone who works attributes work attributes their sense of meaningfulness to, largely to the work they do. So it's not about how I'm feeling moment to moment. In fact, Martin Seligman, the sort of founder of the positive psychology movement, the author of Learned Optimism, his most recent paper says if you want to predict the success of high school students, secondary school students, the greatest predictor of their success will not be their self-esteem, it will be their self-discipline. In other words, the kids who've broken through this idea that I'm special, I'm entitled to everything to be fine, no pain, no failure, no disappointment, broken through that to realising that I'd better knuckle down and get on with this and control myself, are going to do a lot better.
The capacity to deal with failure, and this is something that you pick up as well, that we find it very difficult to enter into failure today.
Yes.
It would seem like it raises the problem. It would seem to me that this is one of the key distinctions between the celebrity life and the heroic life.
Yes.
The celebrity needs everything to be in glitter, in a certain sense, don't they? And it's to be depressed, as we have found some celebrities to be in recent times, is quite antithetical to the celebrity status.
Yes.
You can't square.
Yes.
But the hero is not a celebrity, because the hero is the one who, in fact, is prepared to journey into suffering.
Yes.
And journey into failure and into suffering.
Yes.
At the service of something larger than themselves.
Yes.
There's always the sense of quest that's a part of the heroic life.
Yes.
Where the celebrity, life of the celebrity is at worst, entirely self-centered. The heroic life is that which is fundamentally altruistic.
Yes.
But because it is altruistic, it can in fact accept failure, or it can accept a reality of suffering.
Yes.
So the heroic life is not looking to feel good.
Yes, absolutely.
Because
yes.
they're not looking to feel good, they actually then create a good life.
Yes, absolutely. The person who is living the heroic life, and I like this idea of the hero. The room is full of heroes. Heroes are not necessarily the people who are presented with medals for heroism. The heroes are the people who plug away, consistent with their sense of purpose, their sense of social identity, their sense of responsibility, in the face of disappointment, failure, suffering. One of the girls at this breakfast at Abbottsley this morning was saying, well, if you lead the good life, you will feel good, won't you? I mean, there is a benefit. And I said, well, sometimes you will, and sometimes you won't, and it's irrelevant. And if the goal of the good life is that I'll do good works, I'll help old people across the road, and I'll, be a person who serves others in order to feel better about myself, the virtue is stripped out of it. The point of it has been lost. And the people who do lead heroic lives, the people who care for members of their family who are housebound or demented or disabled or something, there's not a lot of fun in that. They don't feel terrific about that. They often feel angry about it and frustrated that they're socially isolated because they're a carer. The people who soldier on in a relationship with someone who's bruised and troubled and needs a whole lot of healing, that's heroic, but it's not necessarily enjoyable.
No, and I think these are the everyday saints.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's the daily. In fact, I'd go further and actually suggest that in those examples of everyday sanctity, which we see in those whose lives are lived for others, even in the face of difficult feelings, they speak to me of a certain mysticism, but it's a mysticism, through suffering. I remember David Malouf once saying, he wrote the libretto to the opera, Voss.
Yes.
And he has Voss say at one stage, the mystery of life, he says, is not solved by success, but by failure, by a perpetual becoming.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it would seem that this sense of becoming forged in all those myriad acts of self-sacrificial love is in fact what then creates the whole life.
Yes, yes, I support that absolutely. It's interesting that our folklore accepts this, but in the contemporary world we deny the truth of the folklore. The folklore says we grow through pain. And then when we experience pain, we want a pill to mask it, or a drink, or something to distract us and relieve the pain, rather than saying the suffering is actually developing me. You know, I am growing through that.
Something I don't know. I wouldn't want to say uniquely Australian, but particularly Australian, because we are at our best as Australians, aren't we? In the face of suffering. You think of, you know, in the face of disasters like bushfires, like...
Yeah, oh yes.
I mean, even what we celebrate in Anzac, that's really about, none of those experiences leave us feeling good.
No.
In fact, you know, they're experiences of extraordinary loss. And
Yes,
grief.
yes.
And yet it's precisely in those experiences where we show ourselves best as Australians because of our capacity to reach out and to support others and to be with others and to find a sense of companionship with others in the face of adversity. In many ways, it's always struck me that there's a genuinely Australian expression to this everyday mysticism, which we've yet to tap.
Yes.
But which I think is one of the great spiritual strengths of the Australian life.
Yes, yes. Yes, whether it's uniquely Australian, I don't know. I mean, I think we hear of disasters in other places and people rising to the occasion, as Australians do. The mining disaster in Tasmania, Beaconsfield, a few years ago, there was a lot of, I think, exaggerated talk about how that was the heroic rescue efforts and so on were somehow uniquely Australian, as though to say, well, if it had been Chile or Canada or China, they wouldn't have bothered. They would have just said, there's some blokes down there, tough, let's go and have lunch. Well, that's not what humans are like, you know. So I don't know that it is uniquely Australian, but I think in Australia at the moment, again, not uniquely, it's a Western phenomenon, we are at some risk of trying to protect our children from these experiences of suffering and failure, as though everyone must win a prize, no one must fail. At a kid's birthday party now, if they play pass the parcel, every layer that's unwrapped reveals a prize. Well, some of us are old enough to remember a time when you had to go through all the disappointment of unwrapping it and you didn't get the prize, and then the lucky person at the end got the prize. So that's an interesting culture change designed to make it all easier and nicer for kids, so they don't have... I presume they no longer play musical chairs. I don't know how you play musical chairs without taking a chair away and causing someone to be disappointed. But it's I think, a dangerous contemporary trend that children must be protected from failure and disappointment. We shouldn't seek it for them, but we should encourage them to stay with it.
But another kind of indication of that is there's not is the pursuit of the celebrity status, because it, as it were, promises a life without disappointment.
Yes.
It's not unusual to hear young people aspire for celebrity status, as if this were the goal of life.
Yes.
To be the celebrity.
Yes, to be famous. And of course the internet allows everyone to be famous to some extent. You will have seen the change in the culture of weddings. At the moment, Australians on average spend $55,000 on a wedding. And a lot of that is to do with getting the video, you know, being the star, being the celebrity. I was privileged to be shown the wedding album, an actual album, not just online of some young friends who married recently, but in order to be allowed to inspect the album of wedding photographs, I was given white gloves before I was allowed to touch the book, because this was a magical, totemic kind of thing that was the symbol of their celebrity.
Life itself can't, that expectation, life itself outstrips the expectation.
Yes, yes.
And then, of course, we're lost because we don't know how to deal with the failure of the expectation.
Yes, yes. And fame itself, celebrity itself, is of course an appalling thing for anyone to have to go through, which is why there are so many breakdowns of one kind or another among people who've been placed on a pedestal, particularly if they themselves know that it's unwarranted. To have this visited on you is a dreadful burden. Some of them seek it.
Hugh, I'm just conscious of time, but before we, because we're over time in fact, but time has just sped away. But before we do finish, can we just turn to the aspect of what the good life might look like nationally, on a national level. We've talked about how a good life might look personally. And you've identified a whole range of things that contribute to a personal good life. But what does a good life look on a national level? If we were to transpose what you've written about in the book for us as persons, and transpose that onto the national stage,
yes,
and say that the good national life looks like this, what would it look like?
The principles would be exactly the same, David. In politics, we would see people treating each other kindly and with respect, even when they profoundly disagree with each other's philosophies. That is not so hard. I mean, we are, most of us, perfectly capable of dealing kindly with people that we disagree with. We're perfectly capable of treating each other with respect and treating strangers with respect. But our tendency and our willingness to do that will actually, and our capacity to do it, will actually be eroded if we are continually given the example of national leaders who don't do it. And our federal parliament is, at the moment, and has been for a number of years, a disgrace for that reason, because the example that's being given is we will abuse and denigrate each other as if those people are not entitled to be here, as though they're not as legitimate as we are. We won't show respect to the office of Prime Minister. Look what happened when Julia Gillard was our Prime Minister. Now we have an incumbent Prime Minister who, perhaps more than any of his predecessors as an opposition leader, denigrated the position of Prime Minister, now wants us to respect it. Well, it's hard, because when on both sides they're saying the other side's rubbish, the voters are inclined to take away the impression that they're probably all rubbish. They're probably right. You know, the others are hopeless, so they're all hopeless. Now that, in terms of our national psyche and the goodness of our national life, that's an appalling erosion and an appalling example. So our trust, not just in politicians, but in our political institutions becomes eroded, and that's a problem. The church is suffering the same, big business is suffering the same, the trade union movement is suffering the same, commercial, professional sport is suffering the same, this erosion of trust. So were we to focus more on the goodness of our national lives, we would find people running commercial organisations not exploiting their suppliers or their customers or their staff. We'd find them, even in the commercial context, behaving kindly and with respect even towards their own competitors, certainly towards suppliers, customers, staff, etc. If we were committed to goodness in our national life, our attitude to this extraordinary concept of border protection would be utterly different from the way it is now, and it has been in the past, utterly different. This is a new and disturbing phenomenon, the idea that we will repel people who are in great distress and who are seeking asylum here. That would all change overnight if in our national conversation and our national identity we were devoted to the idea that we are the good guys, that this is a good society, a civil society, which means it is a generous, welcoming, accommodating, forgiving society.
Is it possible to be good in the current climate, do you think, in terms of the national life? I mean, I'm thinking there in terms of young people who might have an interest in public life. Extremely difficult for them to assume a good life in the presence of, in this kind of context.
Yes, yes.
Like, what would you say to somebody who is young, who is aspiring to a public life? What are the things that, how would you encourage them?
Well, first of all, I would encourage them. I wouldn't say, as their parents might say, don't do that, politics is a dirty business, don't get into that, because it'll change you. You know, the party system will grind you down, you go in being an idealist and you come out being a pragmatist. Much of that is true. But I would encourage them, as I'd encourage everyone, not just in public life on the national scale, but in positions of local community engagement and even leadership, to live it as we know the best way to live it is, to understand what goodness is, what a civil society is, how we would have to behave to become more like the ideal of the civil society, and stick to that. And if you're defeated in the process, okay, do it in some other context. Stand up for what you know to be right in the commercial world if you know that moral corners are being cut. Say, is this right? Do we believe in this? Is this how we should be treating our customers, for example? But it begins, I think the message is for all of us, it begins in the family, in the street, the neighbourhood, the workplace, the parish, the school, wherever we are individually, we need to be much more outspoken about goodness.
And so I suppose just to conclude there, Hugh, I mean, in many ways the good life, our good life, encourages a goodness, doesn't it?
Yes.
And so...
By example.
By example.
Yes.
And I think that encouragement, indeed, going right back to where we started in terms of the three therapies of the good life, it would seem to me that encouragement is another important ingredient into it.
I agree.
And so the way that if we are seeking ourselves to lead a good life, can encourage others in the same pursuit, that can only argue for the national good. But I also think that part of all of that is another word that comes to mind, and that is the word gratitude.
Yes. To
be able to express thanks to one another, because that too is a sign that one has been truly present, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
And I think we underplay in many ways those two vital human experiences of interaction. Encouragement, which draws out the goodness in another, looks to draw out the goodness in another, and indeed the skill of giving thanks to one another, because that too is deeply encouraging in itself, isn't it?
Yes, yes. Agree absolutely. And I'd say only one other thing, that the gratitude can include being grateful for the dark passages, being grateful for the pain and the suffering and the loss and the disappointment, because we know what it's teaching us.
Well, on that note, Hugh, can I, on behalf of everybody, thank you for the wonderful...
Thank you, David.